Sophia Carter had built a life most would envy. A thriving career in real estate. A beautiful home in the heart of Chicago, and an 11-year-old son. Ethan, who was the center of her world. From the outside, everything appeared perfect. But Sophia had learned that appearances could be deceiving. That morning, as she stood by the kitchen island sipping her coffee, she checked her phone to confirm an important meeting scheduled for later in the day. Just as she glanced at the time, Ethan's voice called from upstairs. 5 more minutes, Mom. Sophia sighed, a soft smile on her lips. Typical. Ethan was bright and full of energy but had inherited his father's habit of stretching time. She took another sip of coffee, her eyes drifting toward the family photos on the wall. One picture, in particular, caught her attention, her wedding photo with Daniel. It had been 12 years since that day. And yet, the man in the photo felt like a stranger now. Daniel, a financial consultant, had always been ambitious, but lately, his long hours had turned into late-night returns and unexpected business trips. A huge project, he always said. A few years ago, she would have believed him without hesitation. Now, she wasn't so sure. Mom, do you think Dad will be home for dinner tonight? Sophia turned to see Ethan standing at the bottom of the stairs. Backpack slung over one shoulder. His tone was casual, but the way he avoided her eyes told a different story. I hope so, sweetheart, she said, forcing a smile, but you know how busy he is. Ethan just nodded, his expression unreadable. He had started asking about his father's absences more frequently, and Sophia was running out of reassuring answers. She grabbed her keys, ready to drive Ethan to the bus stop, when she noticed something strange. The door to Daniel's home office was slightly open. Daniel always kept it locked. Curious, she stepped inside. The room was impeccably neat, but something felt off. A few scattered papers lay in the trash bin. Instinctively, she reached down and fished them out, piecing together a torn note. An address. It was unfamiliar. A chill ran down her spine. Before she could process it, her phone rang, her assistant reminding her of her meeting. Shoving the note into her pocket, she forced herself to focus. She had to push these thoughts aside. Her career depended on it. As she drove away, Ethan waved from the school bus, his smile full of innocence. He had no idea that his mother's perfect world had just started to crack. And deep down, Sophia knew, this was only the beginning. Sophia sat in her sleek office, the Chicago skyline stretching behind her. But for once, she wasn't admiring the view. The unease that had been growing inside her since the morning had solidified into something heavier. Something colder. The torn note. The unfamiliar address. Daniel's increasing absences. She had pushed those thoughts aside for her meeting. But they refused to stay buried. She had barely taken a breath after her presentation when her phone vibrated. She glanced at the caller ID, Mia. Ethan's babysitter. Strange. Mia never called unless it was urgent. With a polite nod to her colleagues, she excused herself and answered the call. Mia? What's wrong? The response she got was not the calm, steady voice she was used to. Instead, Mia sounded panicked, her voice trembling. Sophia, you need to come home. Now. Sophia's blood ran cold. Is Ethan okay? Her voice barely came out. He's safe, but, please, just come home. It's serious. Mia hung up before Sophia could press for more details. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her coat and rushed to the elevator. The confident, composed real estate mogul was gone. Now, she was just a terrified mother. The drive home was a blur of red lights and worst-case scenarios. By the time she pulled into the driveway, her hands were shaking. The front door was slightly ajar. Inside, Mia was sitting on the couch, holding a visibly shaken Ethan. His wide, tear-streaked eyes met hers, and he immediately bolted from Mia's embrace and ran to her. Mom, I'm so sorry, he choked out. Sophia dropped to her knees, holding him tightly. Sorry for what, sweetheart? What happened? Ethan hesitated, his fingers twisting into the fabric of her coat. Mia cleared her throat. He went into Daniel's office. Sophia. Sophia's stomach twisted. I didn't mean to snoop. Ethan whispered, I just wanted to see Dad's calendar. To know when he'd be home. Sophia exchanged a glance with Mia. And what did you find? Ethan bit his lip, then handed her a stack of papers. She took them, her hands trembling as she read. A lease agreement for an upscale apartment. Signed by Daniel. The contract dated back 2 years. And then, a photo, Daniel, smiling warmly, his arm wrapped around a young woman. Beside them, a little girl who couldn't be older than 4. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. A second family. The floor beneath her seemed to vanish. Ethan sniffled. Mom, is Dad leaving us? Sophia swallowed her rising emotions and looked her son in the eye. No, sweetheart, but we're going to find out exactly what's going on. She folded the papers, a cold determination settling inside her. Tonight, she would confront Daniel, and this time, there would be no more lies. Sophia stood in her living room, the documents clenched in her trembling hands. The weight of betrayal pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her husband of 12 years, Daniel, had been living a double life. The apartment lease, the bank statements, the photo of him with another woman and a child, it was undeniable now. He hadn't just been distant. He had been building another home, another family. She forced herself to stay calm for Ethan's sake. Her son sat beside her on the couch, hugging his knees, his small frame shaking. He had discovered this nightmare first. Her little boy had been the one to stumble upon his father's deception. Mom, is Dad leaving us? Ethan asked again, his voice small, uncertain. Sophia knelt in front of him, brushing the hair from his forehead. No, sweetheart, he made his choices, but we're not going anywhere. We'll figure this out, together. The front door opened with a click, and Daniel walked in, tossing his keys onto the table. He barely noticed them at first, loosening his tie and sighing as if he had just come home from a normal day. Sophia felt a sharp stab of anger at the sight of him. How many nights had she waited up for him, worrying? How many times had she convinced herself that his absences, his late nights, his cold demeanor, were all just part of his stressful job? No more excuses, no more lies. Daniel. Her voice was calm, but something in her tone made him stop. His gaze flickered to her, then to Ethan, who refused to look at him. What's wrong? He asked. Feigning confusion, Sophia slowly unfolded the papers and laid them on the coffee table between them. I want you to explain this. Daniel's face drained of color. His eyes darted over the evidence, his name on the lease, the receipts, the damning photograph of him with the woman and the child. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I can explain. Sophia let out a bitter laugh. Can you? Because it seems pretty clear. You've been lying to us for years. Daniel. He took a step forward. Sophia, please, it's not what it looks like. Oh, really? Her voice was dangerously quiet. Because it looks like you have another family. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no defense. Ethan finally looked up, his eyes filled with confusion and hurt. Dad, do you love them more than us? The question struck Daniel harder than anything Sophia could have said. He hesitated, too long. Sophia stood, her hands balling into fists. Get out, Daniel. You don't get to hurt us anymore. This was the end, and for the first time, Sophia wasn't afraid of it. Sophia's hands trembled as she gripped the folder, its contents heavier than any weight she had ever carried. Bank statements, lease agreements, receipts, a photograph. Each piece of evidence was another dagger to her heart. Each document spelling out the undeniable truth: her husband, Daniel, had been living a lie. She had spent years ignoring the signs, the late nights, the whispered phone calls, the unexplained expenses. But she had convinced herself that she was overthinking, that she was just being paranoid. After all, Daniel was her husband, her partner. He would never betray her. Except he had. And now, there was no denying it. The front door opened, and Daniel stepped inside, his usual exhaustion evident in the way he loosened his tie. He had no idea that tonight, everything would change. Hey, he greeted casually, tossing his keys onto the counter. Long day? Sophia stood in the dimly lit kitchen, the only thing separating them being the folder she had placed on the table. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, but her voice was eerily calm. Sit down, Daniel. His brows furrowed. What's going on? Sophia slid the folder toward him. Look inside. Daniel hesitated, then slowly reached for the folder. As soon as he flipped it open, his entire demeanor changed. His breath hitched, his face drained of color, and his fingers visibly trembled as he pulled out the photo, the one that sealed his fate. A woman, a child, his child. Sophia watched as realization dawned in his eyes. He knew he had been caught. Where did you get this? His voice was barely a whisper. Does it matter? She countered, crossing her arms. How long, Daniel? He didn't answer immediately. That was enough. She laughed bitterly, shaking her head. I can't believe this. I gave you everything. Our home, our son, our life. And you, her voice cracked. But she forced herself to stay strong. You threw it all away. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his breathing uneven. It's not. Don't you dare say it's not what it looks like, she snapped, slamming her hand on the table. It's exactly what it looks like. Silence. Does Ethan know? He finally asked, his voice shaking. Sophia's stomach twisted at the mention of their son. Not yet, she admitted, but he will. Daniel's face contorted with something between guilt and fear. Please, Sophia, let's talk about this. No, she stepped back. I want you out. His lips parted as if to protest. But he saw the unwavering resolve in her eyes. There was no way back from this. Tonight, their marriage ended, and for the first time in years, Sophia felt free. Sophia's hands were ice cold as she gripped her phone, rereading the last message Daniel had sent her. We need to talk. That was all it said. No apology, no explanation, just 3 hollow words that meant nothing after what she had discovered. She glanced at the neatly stacked documents on the coffee table, the lease agreement for an apartment she had never known existed, the receipts for luxury gifts that had never been for her, and worst of all, the photograph. A woman, a child, a family that wasn't hers. The front door creaked open, and she heard his familiar footsteps against the hardwood floor. Sophia sat still, her heart pounding like a war drum. Hey, Daniel called, his voice calm, almost casual, like nothing had changed. Like their lives hadn't just shattered into a million pieces. She stayed silent. He walked into the living room, stopping in his tracks when he saw the documents laid out before her. His eyes flickered with something, fear, maybe, or guilt, or the realization that the lies were over. Sophia, his voice was careful now. Where did you get this? She exhaled a sharp breath, her fingers tightening into fists. Does it matter? His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. It's not what you think. Sophia laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. Oh, really? Because it looks like you've been living a double life. And now, I know everything. He stepped forward, reaching for her, but she recoiled. The touch that once brought her comfort now made her sick. How long? She demanded, her voice sharp as a blade. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his face pale. He knew there was no point in lying now. 3 years. 3 years. Her breath hitched, but she refused to break in front of him. So, the late nights? The last-minute trips? The constant excuses? She gestured to the papers. It was all for her? Daniel's silence was all the confirmation she needed. Sophia shook her head, the betrayal cutting deeper than she ever thought possible. And Ethan? Did you ever stop to think about him? About what this would do to our son? Daniel's face crumbled. Sophia, I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, she snapped, her voice shaking. You stole years from me. You made me believe in a life that wasn't real. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I want you out, she said, her voice low but firm. Daniel took a step back, his mouth opening like he wanted to argue, to beg, but he saw it, the unwavering finality in her eyes. There was no forgiveness here, no second chances, no way back. He nodded stiffly, swallowing hard. I'll pack my things. And just like that, the illusion was shattered. The perfect life she thought she had? Gone. But as the door closed behind him, a strange sense of relief washed over her. Because now, she could finally start over. Sophia sat at the kitchen table, her hands gripping the edges of the chair as if holding on for dear life. Her world had been unraveling for months. But now, the final thread had snapped. The truth was right in front of her. Scattered across the mahogany surface, bank statements showing withdrawals she hadn't made. A lease agreement for a luxury apartment she had never set foot in. And a picture of Daniel. Her husband of 12 years. With another woman. And a child. A boy. No older than 3. With Daniel's unmistakable blue eyes and the same dimpled grin he had once promised was only theirs. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she reached for her phone. Barely registering her own shaking fingers as she dialed. The call rang twice before he picked up. Hey, Soph. Daniel's voice was casual, oblivious. Where are you? Her voice was steady, but the steel in it was undeniable. A pause. Then, at the office. Late meeting. Sophia let out a slow breath, biting down the bitter laugh that threatened to escape. He was still lying, even now. Funny, she murmured, tapping her fingers against the table. Because I'm sitting here looking at your little secret. Another pause. This one longer. What are you talking about? His voice was tight now. Careful. You tell me, she shot back, her grip on the phone tightening. Or should I start with the apartment in the city? Or maybe the diamond necklace you sold for cash? Or, her breath hitched as her eyes landed on the photograph once more, your other family? A sharp inhale came through the receiver. Sophia, listen. No, you listen. Her voice trembled with restrained fury. You lied to me for years. I let you come home late. I trusted every excuse. I believed every word. And all this time, you were sneaking off to play house with someone else? Sophia, please, let me explain. She squeezed her eyes shut, feeling the sting of betrayal burn through her chest like acid. Explain? What was there to explain? That for 3 years, he had stolen from their family to fund a second life? That he had kissed her goodnight and whispered, I love you, while his real devotion lay elsewhere? Come home, she ordered, her voice eerily calm. Daniel hesitated. Soph, come home. Silence. Then a quiet, I'm on my way. Sophia hung up and stared at the evidence before her. The man she had built a life with wasn't the man she thought he was. Tonight, she would confront him. Tonight, she would tear down every lie. And after tonight, he would be nothing more than a ghost of her past. Sophia sat on the living room couch, her back rigid, her fingers tightening around the stack of documents in her lap. The house was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, stretching her patience to the breaking point. Her husband, Daniel, was on his way home. Outside, the evening had swallowed the last light of day, draping everything in shadows, a fitting backdrop, she thought bitterly, for the unraveling of her marriage. She had spent the last 3 hours uncovering the truth, receipts from a high-end antique store proving he had sold her grandmother's diamond necklace, a lease agreement for a luxury apartment in the city, and the final, gut-wrenching piece of evidence, a picture of Daniel, arms wrapped around another woman, and a little boy, their son, a child he had hidden from her for 3 years, a child he had with her. The moment the front door clicked open, Sophia stood. She didn't move toward him, didn't greet him the way she once would have. Instead, she watched as Daniel hesitated in the doorway, sensing something was wrong before his eyes even met hers. Hey, he started, forcing a smile. Everything okay? Sophia let the silence stretch, her grip on the papers tightening. Finally, she exhaled sharply. You tell me, Daniel. His smile faltered, his gaze darted to the documents clutched in her hands. Where were you tonight? She asked, her voice deceptively calm. Daniel swallowed. At work. Liar. The word cut through the air like a whip. She tossed the stack of papers onto the coffee table, letting them scatter. His eyes flicked over them, widening as recognition sank in. I went to your little secret apartment today, she continued, stepping closer, forcing him to meet her gaze. Met her. She spat the word like venom. And your son. Daniel's face drained of color. Sophia, don't you dare try to lie to me again. Her voice trembled, not with weakness, but with barely contained fury. 3 years, Daniel. 3 years of sneaking around, of stealing from our family, of looking me in the eye every damn day and pretending everything was fine. He ran a hand through his hair, taking a step toward her. But she backed away. I was going to tell you, he muttered. Sophia let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Oh? Before or after you drained our accounts to support your real family? His jaw clenched. It wasn't like that. Then explain it to me, she snapped, her voice rising, her body trembling with the weight of betrayal. Explain why you sold my grandmother's necklace. Why you funneled money into an apartment I never knew existed. Why you've been playing house with another woman while I've been here. Wondering why my husband was growing distant. Daniel opened his mouth but no words came out. Because there was no explanation. No excuse. For the first time, he looked small, weak. And for the first time, Sophia didn't feel powerless. You need to leave, she said, voice cold as ice. His head snapped up. Sophia, please. No. She squared her shoulders, her decision final. Pack your things. You don't live here anymore. Daniel stared at her, realization dawning. He had lost. And Sophia? She had finally won. Sophia stood at the kitchen window, staring into the night. The city skyline stretched out before her, illuminated by thousands of twinkling lights. Each one a life, a story. Somewhere out there, Daniel was alone, facing the consequences of his actions. The weight of what she had uncovered in the past few days still sat heavy in her chest. But for the first time in a long time, she could breathe. Her fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, her mind replaying the conversation with her lawyer just hours ago. You have enough evidence for a solid case. Sophia, he'll have no choice but to accept the terms. Daniel had spent 3 years living a double life, deceiving her, stealing from her, building another family while keeping her in the dark. And yet, the moment she confronted him, he had the audacity to plead for forgiveness, to act as if this could somehow be fixed. Sophia let out a breath, shaking her head. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She hesitated before picking it up. Daniel. She stared at the name, her heart hammering against her ribs. After a long pause, she pressed the answer button but said nothing. His voice came through, soft, hesitant. Sophia, please, can we talk? A part of her wanted to scream, to ask him what there was left to say. But another part, the part that had spent 12 years building a life with him, remained silent. I messed up, he admitted. I know that, but you have to understand, I never meant for this to happen. She almost laughed at that. Never meant for this to happen? He had signed a lease, sold her family's heirlooms, had a child. Sophia closed her eyes. Stay calm, stay in control. You lied to me for 3 years. Daniel. Her voice was steady, cold. 3 years. Silence on the other end. I don't expect you to forgive me, he finally said, but I can't lose everything, not like this. And there it was. Not I'm sorry for breaking you. Not I regret what I did to our family. No, he was just afraid of losing his comfortable life, the one he had taken for granted. Sophia's grip on the phone tightened. You already have. Daniel. A sharp breath on the other end. You don't mean that. She exhaled slowly, feeling a strange calm settle over her. I do. Her lawyer's words echoed in her mind. You hold all the power now. Sophia, he doesn't get to control you anymore. For years, she had let herself believe she wasn't strong enough to leave. That their marriage, their history, was worth salvaging. But now? Now, she saw the truth. Goodbye, Daniel. She hung up. And just like that, she was free.